4 episodes. That's all it took. Not a full season. Not years of storytelling. Just 4 hours of television, and suddenly something shifted in American pop culture. A show that many initially dismissed as just another edgy teen drama exploded into a full-blown cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Parents were shocked. Critics were divided. Social media was on fire. And millions of viewers found themselves unable to look away, because what they were watching didn't feel like fiction. It felt raw. It felt uncomfortable. And for many, especially younger Americans, it felt painfully real. This is the story of how Euphoria went from a risky HBO experiment to a modern classic in record time. How just 4 episodes redefined what television could look like, sound like, and say. And why, years later, the impact of those first episodes is still shaping the way Hollywood tells stories about youth, identity, addiction, and truth. But more importantly, this isn't just about a TV show. It's about why America couldn't stop watching. When Euphoria premiered on HBO in June 2019, it entered a crowded landscape of so-called teen dramas. But this wasn't built like the shows that came before it. At the center of it all was Zendaya, a former Disney Channel star attempting one of the most dramatic reinventions in modern Hollywood. She played Rue Bennett, a teenager battling drug addiction, depression, and a fragile grip on reality. Behind the camera was Sam Levinson, a writer-director who infused the show with deeply personal elements drawn from his own struggles with addiction. This wasn't just storytelling, it was confession. And that authenticity became the show's most powerful and controversial weapon. From its very first episode, pilot, Euphoria signaled something different. The visuals were cinematic, drenched in neon and shadow. The soundtrack pulsed with emotional intensity, and the storytelling refused to sanitize anything. Drug use wasn't glamorized. It was chaotic and destructive. Relationships weren't romanticized. They were messy and often painful. Identity wasn't simplified. It was explored in all its complexity. But it wasn't until episode 4, Shook One's PT2, that everything changed. That episode didn't just move the story forward. It detonated it.by the time episode 4 aired. Euphoria had already built momentum. But what happened next turned that momentum into something much bigger. The Carnival episode. A seemingly simple setting, a high school carnival, became the backdrop for one of the most emotionally explosive hours of television in recent memory. Every major storyline collided. Ruth spiraled deeper into anxiety and dependency. Jules faced emotional manipulation and danger. Nate's violent tendencies escalated in ways that left audiences stunned, and relationships that once felt fragile began to shatter completely. What made this episode different wasn't just the plot. It was the execution. The camera didn't just observe. It moved with the characters, immersing viewers inside their chaos. The lighting shifted from dreamlike beauty to suffocating tension. The pacing built like a pressure cooker until it finally exploded. And then the internet reacted. Almost instantly, clips began circulating across platforms. Viewers dissected every frame. Critics began rewriting their early reviews. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about whether Euphoria was too much. It was about whether it had just changed television forever. From an industry perspective, what happened with Euphoria was almost unprecedented. Television typically builds its reputation over seasons. Shows take time to find their audience, refine their voice, and earn critical respect. But Euphoria accelerated that timeline dramatically. Within just 4 episodes, it had already established itself as a serious contender in the cultural conversation. Part of that success came down to performance, particularly from Zendaya, whose portrayal of Rue would later earn her an Emmy, making her one of the youngest winners in the category. But beyond performance, the show pushed boundaries in ways that forced the industry to respond. It challenged traditional network storytelling rules. It blurred the line between film and television. And it proved that audiences, especially younger viewers, were willing to engage with darker, more honest narratives than many executives had previously believed. At the same time, the show sparked serious debate. Critics questioned whether it crossed ethical lines in its depiction of teens. Parents worried about its influence. Media outlets ran headlines asking whether it was irresponsible or revolutionary. The truth? It was both. If Episode 4 transformed Euphoria critically, social media turned it into a phenomenon. On platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and later TikTok, the show didn't just trend, it dominated. Scenes became memes. Dialogue turned into captions. Visuals inspired entire aesthetic movements. Young Americans, in particular, connected deeply with what they were seeing, not necessarily because they lived the same experiences, but because the emotions felt authentic. Anxiety, loneliness, identity struggles, addiction, love. These weren't presented as distant issues. They were immediate, personal, and impossible to ignore. At the same time, the conversation was far from unified. Some viewers praised the show as groundbreaking and necessary. Others criticized it as excessive or triggering. But in the world of modern media, one thing was clear. Silence is failure. Controversy is engagement. And Euphoria had both attention and impact. The success of Euphoria, especially so early in its run, sent a message to Hollywood. Audiences were changing. They didn't want sanitized stories. They didn't want predictable narratives. They wanted something that felt real, even if that reality was uncomfortable. And studios began to listen. In the years following Euphoria, a wave of darker, more stylistically ambitious shows began to emerge. The boundaries of what television could depict and how expanded rapidly. At the same time, the show influenced more than just storytelling. Fashion, makeup, music, and even cinematography trends shifted in response to its aesthetic. The Euphoria look became instantly recognizable and widely imitated. But perhaps the biggest shift was psychological. The industry realized that younger audiences weren't just passive consumers. They were participants. They analyzed. They debated. They shared. And they demanded authenticity. At its core, the story of Euphoria isn't about ratings or awards. Confront us. And in those first 4 episodes, Euphoria did exactly that. So now the question turns to you. Did Euphoria truly become a modern classic after just 4 episodes, or did the hype arrive too fast? Was it groundbreaking storytelling, or a controversial moment that simply captured the internet's attention at the right time? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation is far from over. If you want more deep dive investigations into the stories shaping modern culture, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because sometimes the biggest cultural shifts don't take years. Sometimes they happen in just 4 episodes, and just when audiences thought they understood what Euphoria was. The show shifted again. Because episode May 4th have been the explosion, but episode 5 was the aftermath. And in many ways, it was even more devastating. There's a moment early in that episode where everything slows down. The chaos of the carnival is gone. The lights are dimmer. The energy is quieter, but heavier. And suddenly, the consequences of everything that happened begin to settle in. Rue isn't just struggling anymore. She's unraveling. Played with staggering emotional precision by Zendaya, Rue's descent becomes almost unbearable to watch. The show strips away any illusion of control and forces viewers to confront addiction in its rawest form, not as a plot device, but as a lived reality. There are no dramatic speeches. No easy resolutions. Just silence, isolation, and a growing sense that something is deeply, irreversibly wrong. For many viewers, this was the moment Euphoria stopped being a bold show and became something much more serious. It became personal. So why did America become so obsessed so quickly? The answer isn't simple. But it starts with something fundamental. Recognition. Unlike traditional teen dramas that often present heightened, idealized versions of youth, Euphoria leaned into discomfort. It didn't try to make its characters likable. It made them real. And psychologically, that creates a powerful reaction. When viewers see exaggerated perfection, they disconnect. But when they see flawed, struggling, complicated people, they lean in. They project. They empathize. They remember. And for a generation growing up in the age of social media, where identity is constantly curated and filtered, the unfiltered intensity of Euphoria hit differently. It exposed what many were already feeling but rarely saying out loud. Loneliness in a hyper-connected world. Pressure to define yourself before you understand yourself. The constant tension between who you are and who you're expected to be. These aren't just themes. They're lived experiences for millions of Americans. And suddenly, there was a show that wasn't just acknowledging that reality, it was centering it. But with that level of raw honesty came something else. Backlash. Almost as quickly as Euphoria gained praise, it attracted criticism, and not quietly. Major media outlets began questioning whether the show had gone too far. Discussions around its explicit content, particularly involving teenagers, became unavoidable. Parents voiced concerns. Advocacy groups raised alarms. Was it responsible? Was it exploitative? Or was it simply telling the truth that others were too afraid to show? The debate became national. And in many ways, that controversy only amplified the show's reach. Because controversy does something very specific in modern media. It forces attention. People who had never heard of Euphoria suddenly wanted to see what the outrage was about. Viewers who might have ignored it now felt compelled to watch and form their own opinions. And as they did, something interesting happened. Many of them didn't walk away. They stayed. Not because the show was easy to watch, but because it was impossible to ignore. The center of all of this, beyond the visuals, beyond the controversy, were the performances. And leading that charge was Zendaya. Before Euphoria, she was known, recognized, successful. But after those first few episodes, especially episodes 4 and 5, she was something else entirely. She was undeniable. Critics who had once associated her with lighter roles suddenly found themselves reevaluating everything. Her portrayal of Rue wasn't just convincing. It was immersive. It felt less like acting and more like exposure. And she wasn't alone. Hunter Schafer brought a quiet, deeply emotional complexity to Jules, a character navigating identity, vulnerability, and danger all at once. Jacob Elordi delivered a chilling performance as Nate, capturing a level of intensity that made audiences uncomfortable in the most intentional way. And Sydney Sweeney began building what would later become one of the most talked-about character arcs in the series. These weren't just good performances. They were defining ones. The kind that shift careers and reshape an entire show's legacy. There's another reason Euphoria became a modern classic so quickly, and it has nothing to do with plot. It's how the show looked. From a technical standpoint, Euphoria didn't feel like television. It felt like cinema. The camera moved with intention. The lighting told its own story. Every frame felt composed, deliberate, and emotionally charged. And that level of visual storytelling changed expectations. Viewers began to notice things they hadn't before: color palettes, shot composition, transitions. They weren't just watching scenes anymore. They were experiencing them. For the industry, this created pressure. Because once audiences see what's possible, they don't want to go back. And Euphoria raised the bar. Not gradually. Instantly. Then there's the music. Because if the visuals pulled viewers in, the soundtrack made sure they stayed. Created in large part by Labyrinth, the score of Euphoria didn't just accompany scenes, it elevated them. It filled in the emotional gaps. It amplified tension. It turned quiet moments into something overwhelming. There are scenes in those early episodes where very little is said, but everything is felt. And that's the power of sound design when it's done right. It bypasses logic and goes straight to emotion. By the time the first season continued beyond episode 4, the conversation had already shifted. No longer was Euphoria just promising. It was essential viewing. And when Zendaya eventually took home an Emmy for her performance, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt inevitable. Because those first 4 episodes had already done the hardest thing any show can do. Success in Hollywood is rarely quiet. But what happened to Euphoria after just 4 episodes wasn't just success. It was acceleration. The kind that doesn't give you time to adjust, to process, or to breathe. Overnight, the show wasn't just popular, it was under a microscope. Every performance was analyzed. Every scene was debated. Every creative decision was questioned, praised, or criticized in real time. And for the cast, many of whom were still early in their careers, that kind of attention came with a level of pressure that few are prepared for. At the center of that pressure was Sam Levinson. Because when a show feels this personal, this raw, this unapologetically honest, it inevitably raises a difficult question. Where does storytelling end and lived experience begin? Levinson had been open about drawing from his own history with addiction, and that authenticity was part of what made the show resonate so deeply. But it also meant that the emotional weight carried by the actors and the expectations placed on them were unusually intense. Scenes weren't just about hitting marks or delivering lines. They were about emotional exposure. And when millions of viewers are watching, analyzing, and reacting in real time, that exposure becomes something else entirely. It becomes pressure point. One of the most powerful and complicated effects of Euphoria's early success was how quickly it blurred the line between fiction and reality. For viewers, the characters didn't feel distant. They felt familiar. Rue wasn't just a character. She became a symbol of struggle that many recognized in themselves or in people they knew. Jules became a reflection of identity exploration in a rapidly changing cultural landscape. Nate became a chilling embodiment of unresolved anger and control. And when characters feel that real, something unusual happens. Audiences begin to treat them as real. That emotional investment is what made the show so impactful, but it also created tension. Because while viewers were forming deep connections, the actors themselves were still navigating their own identities outside of those roles. Zendaya, in particular, found herself at the center of that dynamic. Her performance as Rue was so immersive, so convincing, that many viewers struggled to separate the character from the person. And that's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's the mark of extraordinary acting. On the other, it creates expectations and assumptions that can be difficult to manage. Because no matter how real a performance feels, it is still a performance. Inside Hollywood, the reaction to Euphoria wasn't just admiration. It was strategic. Because when a show breaks through this quickly, this loudly, and this culturally, it forces the industry to pay attention. Executives began asking new questions. Were audiences ready for darker, more emotionally complex storytelling? Was there a growing appetite for shows that didn't follow traditional narrative structures? Could television push boundaries the way film once did, and perhaps even go further? The answer increasingly seemed to be yes. And that realization triggered a shift. Studios and streaming platforms began investing more aggressively in projects that prioritized tone, atmosphere, and emotional depth over formulaic storytelling. The definition of what a teen drama could be expanded almost overnight. But there was also caution. Because while Euphoria succeeded, it did so with a very specific voice, a voice that couldn't easily be replicated. And that's the risk of chasing a phenomenon. You can imitate the surface, but you can't manufacture authenticity. As Euphoria continued to gain traction, the national conversation around it became increasingly divided. On one side were those who saw the show as groundbreaking, a bold, necessary portrayal of issues that had long been ignored or softened for mainstream audiences. On the other side were those who viewed it as troubling, even dangerous, questioning whether its graphic content crossed a line, particularly given the age of its characters. This wasn't a quiet disagreement. It became a cultural debate. Articles were written. Panels were held. Conversations unfolded in homes, classrooms, and online spaces across the country. And at the center of it all was a fundamental question. What responsibility does art have when it reflects reality so closely? Should it protect? Or should it reveal? There isn't a simple answer. But what Euphoria demonstrated, very quickly, was that audiences were willing to engage with that question. Even if it made them uncomfortable, Tio fully understand why Euphoria became a modern